Welcome, everyone. Teaching a child, speaking to a child about death. About death. Children, of course, range in age from newborn infants. Obviously, we're not going to talk about it with them. But once they get around 3 years old, 4 years old, and in increasing increments after that, 5 to 7, 7 to 9, and so on and so on, the topic of death or dying may show up in your child's life. Now, for example, let's say you have a 4 year old and you're walking down the street and they happen to stumble across a sparrow, a bird that has crossed over, a bird that has died. And they say to you, "What happened to this bird? What happened?" Or perhaps they go a little further down and unfortunately a squirrel or a raccoon or a possum or some other creature of the night or day is struck by an automobile. And we see in the curbside the remains of a raccoon that has died or a squirrel has died, and the child is 6 or 7 years old. And they say, "What happened? What happened?" "Oh, they were hit by a car." "I know, but what happened to them?" And someone responds to them, "They have died." Or you're 8 or 9 years old and you witness your parents crying in the living room and you walk out and you say to your mom and your dad, one or the other or both, "What happened? Why are you crying?" And they say, "Oh, it was so sad. Nana died. Grandpa just passed away. And we are very heartbroken. We're very upset." These are not uncommon scenarios for children to be exposed to hear. Now, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but going back in the quote old days, I'm talking about in the 50s and the 60s, let's call it, in my personal experience, death was not something we avoided in my family, but it was not something that children were typically included with. The wake, the funeral, the ceremonies before and after, witnessing people in the living room rubbing their eyes, crying with tissues, and often the 7 or 8 year old, including myself, my mom would say, "Rob, go downstairs and watch some TV. We have to talk about Nanny for a while. Could you please leave us alone?" There was always this kind of protective exclusion from the sorrow that death brought. Um, Even back then, I don't recall very often, if ever, being brought into a funeral parlor to see a dead body, a corpse laying in a casket. It may have happened, but I don't recall it. I think I would have. I don't recall my parents bringing my brothers either to funerals as a young person. And this was part of the social upbringing that we had. We came out of a religious background and we observed the certain sanctity of the funeral process. But as far as children go, back then at least, it was kind of uh, avoided. The topic was too sensitive. Don't worry about it. You're only kids. This is an adult thing. This is not a child thing. That typical scenario was coached into my upbringing. Now, over time, as I entered my teenage years, my early middle years, then of course, I started attending funerals, and my mom would put me in a suit with a tie and whatever, and I would show up and cry with everybody else, and express my condolences to my grandmother or to my uncle or someone close like that. So in today, and this is not just a new age thing, this has been going on for quite some time, there has been a different approach taken towards children and expressing to them about death, about dying, about what is happening. Now, there are certain things that I think we should avoid. Sometimes people say, "Oh, if they look into the casket and they say, if you bring a child to a funeral and you say, what happened to grandma? She's laying in that big box over there." Remember now, they're only kindergarten, maybe a little older, and they're being brought into a funeral parlor. Many people might say, "Oh, well, they've gone to heaven, they've gone to God, they're only sleeping, you'll see them again." These statements, even though I understand the intention is to soften the blow, can be very misleading and very confusing to young children unless they're age appropriate, where they have maturated, they have matured enough to really kind of sense and comprehend what death really begins to mean to them, you know. As you all know, I mean, for many people, people see death as the ending of things. You know, daddy has died, grandma has died, Aunt Mary has died, and it's considered the ending, the finish. And if a child sees the death of the grandmother, for example, as the ending of her, the finishing of her, even at a little age, they'll say, I'll never see her again. Those kind of statements, or what happened. And especially if the death comes in an unpleasant way, a vehicular accident, a drug overdose. Unfortunately, in some cases, people interrupt their own lives. Sometimes people cause murder, you know, and you have to be very judicious in what we explain to children. Now, I'm talking about the elementary level kids. Once they're getting up into that junior high, middle high, high school age, they're seeing it on the internet, they're hearing it on the news, they're hearing it in school, they're hearing it amongst friends. So there, my tone is a little different. So I'm really leaning this more towards, at least this conversation is leaning towards the younger ones. Now, I'm going to come at you from a few different approaches on this. From my perspective, and having worked with children over 27 years who have come to see me and visit me about the loss of their parents. Now, usually I don't see children this young. I do not. They have to be in teenage years. But I have met with them separately. I've met them in parking lots. I've met them in restaurants. I've bumped into parents. And we speak about it, you know, we talk. One of the examples that I like to use with children is one that I witnessed firsthand when I was studying at a monastery in the upstate of New York. And the question had come up to one of the teachers there about what is death? How does it express itself? Is there some simple way of explaining it? And the teacher took a glass of water and he filled the glass up. It was a small glass, nothing big. And he filled it up with beautiful, clear, crystal clear water. And he said, this glass is you. And inside it is your essence, your soul, your light, your love. Everything is the liquid. You contain it. You contain it. And he put it by the windowsill. And over a period of a couple of days, we all began to see the decline in the volume of water in the glass. We understood evaporation was taking place. Yes, we understood. But the analogy and the metaphor was working. And at the end of about a week's time, 5-6 days' time, the glass was completely empty and dry of water. He then proceeded to show us the empty glass and said, what happened to the water inside? And of course, we all commented that it evaporated, it went up into the sky, it drifted away. And the water in the glass had dissolved, had disappeared. In effect, the water had died. Right? That evening, it began to rain. There was a pretty heavy rain. Now, whether he knew it was going to rain or not, I don't know. But it certainly, maybe he checked the calendar or checked the weather report. I don't know. But it seemed very interesting to all of us that the very night that he needed to do the glass, story of the glass and the empty glass, he stuck the glass back out on that same shelf with the window open. And in a very quick amount of time, since it being a small glass, that glass refilled. And he put the glass back down and said, oh, you have returned. Oh, you have returned. So we saw this very simple but very powerful demonstration that within the human form, the glass, the body, there is this essence, this consciousness, but to the child we use the word soul or your spirit or the light inside of you, something very simple metaphorically. And this light moved along. It grew, it expanded, it stretched itself out into the universe to experience the wind and the sun and the elements and the trees. The water went out to take care of plants. The water went out to take care of life forms. The water went out perhaps falling in some puddle someplace and animals could drink from it. So the purpose of the soul was not only here and gone, but the water in the glass went out as kind of a loving promise to the universe. And yet, it also returned back to the source within the glass. So I remember him saying, excuse me, here you are, there you go, here you come back home. You will always return back home. And there was this beautiful analogy of this leaving and changing, leaving and changing, leaving and changing. And the Zen master had expressed this is a very beautiful way of showing the movement of death to children. That was really the essence of this talk. It really wasn't designed, for adults, because that question did come up. Now, I want to interject here for a moment, and I want to go back to my early years. The reaction to death, the reaction to someone that you know is dying, can be very daunting. And for certain people, and many of them, and many of you, and people I know, when they know that someone is dying, they go into this beginning stages, this anticipatory stages of great grief. They are crying, they are sobbing, they are wailing in the night. They express, on many levels, the great pain of the wound that is coming. So if you're watching your mom, or you're watching your dad, or you're watching your older brother break apart when the word death enters the conversation, and you're only 5 years old, your reaction to death can be very, very frightening. You have been taught, you're witnessing it, you're seeing it with people that you trust, that the process we call death, this name death, the guy with the cowl over his head with the big, the sickle and the scary face and the big skinny fingers, that whole goosebumps type of a thing enters the child's mind. And when they hear that death has arrived, it can scare the heck out of them. And rightfully so. They don't know what the hell they're being exposed to, really. And the people they trust and love around them are saying, oh yes, when death comes, it's terrible. Oh my God, it's horrible. Look, I can't breathe, I can't talk. And I'm not asking anyone out there to not have those natural grief reactions. If that's the way you grieve, that's the way you grieve, right? There's no measuring grief, there's no timing grief, there's no best way to grieve. No, I'm not implying that. But what I'm saying is when you're dealing with the children and they are witnessing it, I suggest that you kind of reel it in a little bit, keep those moments after they've gone to sleep, talk about it more calmly and more quietly with these guys, because they're just too little to process. Now, I want to again emphasize this is in the young ones, the kindergartners, the nursery school, that younger group. I'm not talking about 10, 12, 14-year-olds. There it's really, they're kind of stepping up into adult thinking, as it were. And that can be combined with not only a social family attitude towards death, but a religious or a spiritual approach as well, right? For people that are atheistic and they are raising their families, and it doesn't make anything flawed in them, nothing wrong. If someone is atheist, they just don't believe in a divine God, they may say the expression, when you're dead, you're dead. Meaning, when you die, everything stops forever. Now, if you hear that as a child and you say, if I die, I will lose everyone I've ever known. I will not be here anymore. I won't even know who I am. I'm just going to go in the ground and disappear. That can scare anyone. I think anybody would be frightened of that, right? So I'm just suggesting that you be a little diligent, a little do processing here, not to be overly dramatic. Now, coming back, so the analogy of the water, I hope helps you. That's a great one. I've done it with my own children, and I did it with my kids when our pets died. I'm a dog guy. I've had dogs since I'm a little boy, and I started to learn about death not only through family members, but I remember when my first dog died, and he died in the living room, and my brothers and I were there to see that. And when I had children that many years later, when one of our animals passed away, my kids were really little, we didn't really expose them to it. But when they were around 8 or 9, 7 or 8 years old, one of our other dogs passed away. And they all sat around the dog. The dog was downstairs in our den on a blanket. coming to his end of days, right? His name was Koji. And the kids sat down and I explained to them Koji's body is finishing. The water, his light has left. We're going to take care of his body. We're going to make sure it's safe. And we wrapped him in a blanket and we put little toys in with him. And the kids put some pictures in around him. And we made funeral arrangements for the dog. And I explained to my children that our dog is one of my kids, another one of my kids in a way. I said, you know, Koji has to go. Well, Daddy, where has Koji gone? Now, in my family, we use the term heaven. I said, Koji has crossed the rainbow bridge. Now, I understand that's a metaphor, and I understand certain people, oh, that's fantasy. Yes, it is. It's a form of soothing. It allows them to create an image in their mind of a pleasant ending, not, well, he's in the ground, he's dead, and bugs are going to eat him. You don't say these things to kids. You just don't. You can choose to do it, but understand the harm that it's causing. There's a certain truth in the process, excuse me, but sometimes that truth, even though it will set you free, it has to come at an appropriate time, right? It has to come at an appropriate time. So I didn't lie to them. I simply said, Koji is moving along. He's crossing what a lot of people like to call the rainbow bridge. If you ever see a rainbow, as a little one now, players keep this in mind, you may see the dogs going over the rainbow bridge. It's kind of like a fantasy a little bit to soften the hit, to soften the head. Yeah, but we're not going to see him again. I said, he'll come back around in another form. You may not see him as Koji anymore, but his water will return to us in some way. And what I did was we actually went out into the yard and we planted a little tree. And I said, you know, why don't we put a tree in the ground and maybe Koji's spirit will come back through the tree and we'll make that tree grow into a big, beautiful tree and we'll remember him that way. And sure enough, that tree blossomed over time with beautiful little flowers. And they may have forgotten that story, but back then they participated in this little ritual of planting a tree in honor of Koji. So it made them feel they were purposeful. They were doing something. I didn't say Koji ran away. I didn't say Koji went to sleep. I said, Koji's body has stopped. He's old. He was almost 13 at the time. I said, his body is worn out. God, in my case, I used the word God, has called him back home to take care of him. But his soul will come back to us when it's ready and when he is at peace. So I did that with my kids way, 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 way back. And I kind of carry that along when I'm working with families and they introduce me to a young child who has lost a pet, as an example. Now, when it comes to an adult or someone close, especially when it comes to the death of one of their siblings, when you have a 6 or 7-year-old who heartbreakingly has lost a 10-year-old brother who had a medical condition that would offer no relief, and the 10-year-old sibling has crossed over, it is brutal, not only for the parents, but for the child. And this is a word of warning here, and I've seen it, and I've seen it, and I've seen it. Many times people get rid of the child. They say, go in your bedroom. I don't want to talk about it. It's too upsetting. Don't you understand? We lost your brother. And the child says, yeah, but I'm still here. Well, that's not important right now. Your brother died. That's all that we care about. That can be a very, very tough thing for a child to swallow. I understand your intentions. I understand the suffering. I understand the heartbreak, the overwhelming grief of the family. It is unbearable. And to have a child kind of hanging on you, crying, they need you. Big time. The soul of the child is in God's gentle care. That will be dealt with in a different topic. But for this one, if there's a living child, living siblings who are enduring the loss of their sibling, please go soft, go slow, and don't lie to them, meaning, oh, he's on vacation, he's just sleeping in the casket, he'll be back. Those kind of comments just don't cut it. They know that something has happened, but you can keep it soft. And that brings me to this next topic. There was a wonderful book. Some of you may have heard of it. If you haven't read it, you got to read it. It's written by the great Leo Buscaglia, a wonderful, wonderful writer, a therapist, a spokesman for the book he called, which was called Love. His actual big book was called Love. But he also wrote a book called The Fall of Freddie the Leaf. And that had a tremendous effect on me. It had a great effect on so many parents. Many therapists recommend it. It is highly, highly suggested for all ages. It's not just a book for kids, but it's written in a way that a child can understand it. And basically, what it means is, or what the book expresses, is that if you watch a tree, a tree is growing, and if you take a child out right after the winter thaw, where those little buds are blossoming on the tree, you can see them kind of coming out. And you can show it to a child and say, look, you see the tree? All these little buds are about to blossom. Oh, wow, isn't that beautiful? And the season of winter into spring, spring into summer, the tree begins to blossom, the flowers begin to bloom, the leaves begin to prosper. And you say to the child, remember back in the spring, they were only little, just hanging there in the cold wind of the end of spring. And now they've really grown. They're beautiful. They provide shade. The smell is beautiful. They are full of life, right? Over time, the season of summer changes and we enter into the season of fall. Now, when you're in the season of fall, you're beginning to get older. You're beginning to ripen. You're beginning to age. And the child begins to have this mental image of starting out as an infant, early spring, blossoming into a young, healthy teenager and a young adult, summer, fall enters, and we're starting to get a little bit slower. Our bones are a little bit more brittle. The branches on the trees are getting a little bit more brittle. The leaves are now beginning to change from bright green into this gorgeous yellow, gold, red, orange, all the vibrant colors of autumn. But the tree is still moving along just beautifully, right? People are looking at the awe and the beauty of the tree. And then we begin to enter the final season of our days, which is the winter of our life. And the child then all of a sudden walks out to school one day, looks out the front door, the parents are bringing it out, and they see the lawn full of leaves, right? The dark brown leaves, the crunkling of the leaves, the falling off of the tree, the wind that blows through and knocks them to the ground. And now the child is looking at the tree once again, and the branches are bare of all green life, of all the flowers. Everything has fallen away naturally, as Mother Nature has intended it for every living organism. And you say to the child, we're at the end of our winter season. It is a time of quiet and renewal. And renewal. And the child says, what are you talking about? Say, what fell away will be reborn again. It will come back. No, it won't. They're gone. You'll see. And come spring, you show them again this little tree, the same tree. Say, it's the same tree. Remember how the leaves all fell away? Yes, yes. Well, take a look now. It's March, April, and the little buds are right there again. And you bring out to them, what will happen next once spring goes into summer? Well, they're going to open up again, and they will have this beautiful tree again all summer. And you say back to that child, this is the cycle of life. This is the circle of life, right? This is how it moves. People are born, people end. You can use the word death, there's nothing wrong with it, and people die. What does death mean? That simply means that the body has finished its job and it's moving along, and the body has to be placed, in a proper way, right? In a proper way, but the soul, the light continues to shine, right? And with that, memory is very important. For children to be permitted to write, excuse me, to draw, talk openly about their feelings. Yes, but I miss Nanny, I miss Nanny. Let them cry. Hold them and comfort them. We all miss Nanny. We all miss Nanny. We all miss Papa. We all do. And it's okay to cry. Tears are the tiny baby prayers of your soul. You're still praying to them. You're calling out to them. It lets them know how much you love them. and how much they notice you. And you keep it as simple and as gentle as possible. Now, when the age of real reasoning begins, you can perhaps shift gears a little bit and be a little bit more directed, a little bit more specific about what death means. But do not avoid the word death. Let the child be comfortable with knowing that things do die, that things change, that things don't remain forever. The one thing I teach my kids, of course, is the one thing that always remains is love, because love never ends and love never finishes when death arrives. That's just back to you big guys for a minute that are listening to this. That's the basis of the work I do. But getting back to this topic, so you have this really easy to do, easy to teach metaphor or analogy or example with the glass and the water. If that one is not comfortable for you, or you feel it's a little obscure, which I think it's pretty straight, but if you feel differently, the fall of the Freddie the Leaf is a wonderful approach. And I encourage you, if you have little ones at home, if you have children in that age of development where they're starting to be asking questions, or people around them have died or are dying, that's a wonderful book to read to them. It's a wonderful book to share with these kids. So I encourage you to get it. It's been out forever. It's called The Fall of Freddie the Leaf by Leo Buscaglia. Great book. I really encourage that book to all of you. For a little bit more of the more matured people here, there's a book called On Death and Dying by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote about the stages of grief and the process of dying. Because grief does have its evolution, grief does have its stages. And please, folks, children grieve also. To make them go to bed, stick a computer in front of their face, ask them not to bother you, tell them to go cry by themselves, go to the movies, go play with your friends, and their hearts are breaking. They don't know where to turn. They don't know what to do. They don't know what the hell is going on, right? They really don't. They're just learning about death for the first time. And I guarantee you, many of you out there, I would just make a reasonable guess. When you guys were young, death was almost like a no-no. And as you also know, in certain cultures, death becomes like a show. People, and I don't mean it in a negative way, I'm not saying it to be negative, but the dark dresses, I met friends of mine coming out of certain cultural traditions. When their husband died, they wore black every single day. They had professional people that came to mourn at their funeral. Actual people who didn't know the person in the casket, but they came just to cry. They were paid to cry. There are people that see death as the ending of all things. They maintain their life will never be the same. They become almost emotionally a cripple from it. They can't get out of bed. And I'm not saying this is not true to those people. I'm not saying there aren't certain losses that would not drive anyone into that dark place. I'm not minimizing that, so please don't misunderstand me. But if you're a 5 or a 6 or a 7-year-old or a 4-year-old watching your parents go through this, or watching your grandmother go through this, and you grew up saying, oh my God, death is the worst thing that could ever happen. I'm scared to death of it. And if they're scared of death, what happens when I die? It'll be terrible. Oh my God. That could put the fear of the devil in the child, and I'm playing off of a metaphor. It could make any child, 6, 7-year-old child, go on a bed staring at the ceiling, thinking ghosts are in the closet. I mean, it could be really unnerving. So I'm asking politely of all of you, do not avoid the topic of death. Don't throw it in their face. But if they see a sparrow on the street, if they see a squirrel or a raccoon who sadly was hit by a vehicle or something, or the neighbor's child unfortunately got very sick, and you're going to stop by with a piece of a cake and sit down and talk with them and grieve with them, and let them see you cry. Let them see you express your emotions. Let them see that the loss of someone can be painful. We don't want to candy coat it. We don't want to over fictionalize it. But at the same time, you have to soften the blows. So my other suggestion is when death does arrive, there's a ritual of helping to heal. And this is playing music that the loved one loved. This is talking about stories. This is looking at photographs, watching home movies, DVDs, whatever it might be, honoring them, giving them a sense of purpose where they can Plant the flower in the backyard, bring them to a cemetery if that's what you choose. Let them place something and say, oh, why are we placing flowers at Nana's grave? Well, it's something that lets Nana know, her soul know, her beautiful light know that we're thinking of her. Flowers are beautiful, but flowers also wilt. Have you not seen that? That's why we don't really place typically, plastic flowers on someone's grave. I'm not saying that if you do, it's a big bag thing. But generally people tend not to do that because the flower itself, the rose or the lily or whatever flower you may like, is placed on the grave. It too will die at the grave as well. It will too also die. So it joins in the soul of the departed, as it were. So all of these little tips, all of these little hints are designed to help all of you, including me, deal with kids. My grandkids are getting older. They're starting to come up. My oldest one is going to be 8. It's starting to come up in topic a little bit. And I'm using exactly the same analogies with her. It hasn't really risen yet. She's kind of hearing about people that are dying and things like that. But it's coming. And I don't want my children ever to fear death. I don't want them to know that death is a scary thing. I also tell them all the time, death is just part of being born. You're born through mommy. You're going to have this wonderful experience as a person. And then your body will end again and you'll go back to where you came from, which people call heaven. Now, many people point away when they use the term heaven. I've talked about this in other chats. And many people point into the sky and you say, oh, where's my mom? Oh, she died. Where did she go? Well, she went out there into heaven somewhere. And this form of separation can also be very confusing and very daunting. There was a great spiritual teacher that said the kingdom of heaven is within you. The young man on the cross said, the kingdom of heaven is with you, which means the soul of that person has never really pulled away from the ones they love. They're not out there in some never land, just gone. If a child hears that about their father or their mother, they're going to be devastated. If they think their little sister or brother is gone forever in never land, and the child's only 6 or 7 years old, it's going to be very, very difficult to get past the grief that child's going to handle. I'm not saying to lie, because the consciousness of the soul absolutely continues after physical death. There's no question about that. And so let the child understand that there is only a change happening, a shift. And to finish with this, which is the third analogy, which I think really works for kids, and especially if you have a storybook about it, or you can show them a DVD or something, it's really cool. And that is the proverbial butterfly. And the child sees the caterpillar, right? The caterpillar, and you say, oh, the caterpillar's getting old, the caterpillar's in a cocoon, the caterpillar is beginning to die. And the child says, I don't want the caterpillar to die. Well, it's dying, but something else is happening. And little by little, the child begins to see and experience and witness, hopefully, the miraculous change from caterpillar into butterfly. And that is a marvelous example. So when you see butterflies out in your backyard, perhaps over the summer or early fall, you can say, you see these butterflies running around? You see all the butterflies at the butterfly plant? All these butterflies? All of them were caterpillars that died. They died and they became reborn. They got their lives back in a brand new way. And that is exactly what happens to all of us. We die and we become these beautiful butterflies. You can't see these butterflies, right? You can't see them, but they're there and you can feel them and you can sense their love. And all of these analogies work for children. So you have the water in the glass, you have fall of the Freddie of the leaf, and then you have the butterfly, the chrysalis of caterpillar into butterfly. Please, if you have little ones especially, I strongly encourage you to take these approaches when the topic comes up. You don't have to spoon feed it to them, or I want to talk to you about death tonight. No, of course not. But there'll be plenty of examples in the world where you can take a quiet opportunity to make them feel comforted that dying is part of living. It is a natural process and not something to be feared and be devastated by. But part of that same process is the grief process. And that is part of all human animals, right? It's part of all of us is to grieve. So I wanted to let you guys know how I approach my work when I deal with young kids. If you have them yourself, I'm sure all of you have some other ideas, which I hope are great. But be gentle with the little ones, be slow, ease them into this. There's no reason to jolt them, and allow them to process on their own. The stronger you are, the more compassionate you are, the more loving you are. Let them cry in your lap, let them hold them, lay down in bed with them before they go to sleep, say a prayer, sing a song, do something to allow them to feel involved and not excluded without overwhelming them with too much too soon. That's it. Thank you all for joining me. Have a great time.